Today, we're jumping into a kind of intellectual detective story. Our quest is to understand one of the oldest and, honestly, most powerful tools humanity has ever invented for making sense of the world, the myth. And what's so fascinating is that the answer to the question, what is a myth, has changed so much over the centuries. That journey tells us a ton about ourselves, not just about the stories.
Okay, let's just get this out of the way right now. When you and I are talking and we say something is a myth, we usually mean it's not true, right? It's a lie, a falsehood. But for the people who actually study this stuff for a living, that is like the most boring and unhelpful way to think about it. In fact, it completely misses the whole point.
So if a myth isn't a lie, then what in the world is it? Well, the academic view is that a myth is somebody's truth. Think about that. It's a story that a culture tells itself that feels so true, so fundamental, that it literally shapes their reality. It's not about being factually correct. It's about giving a community a shared framework for meaning. You can almost say it's the software that runs a society's hardware.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to get our definitions straight. So before we can trace the wild history of how we've tried to understand myths, we need to see how scholars separate them from all the other kinds of stories we tell.
This table lays it all out perfectly. Look at that last column, core function. That's the key. A myth, you'll see, has gods, it's set way back in the primordial past, and its job is to explain how the world and all its rules came to be. Then you have a legend. This features human heroes in a time that feels kinda historical, and its purpose is to create a group's identity. Think King Arthur or Robin Hood. A folktale? That's about regular people or maybe some clever animals in that vague once-upon-a-time world, mostly to entertain us or teach a simple lesson. And history? Well, that's us, trying to figure out what really happened in our own timeline. The big takeaway here is that these stories are all doing very different jobs.
All right, let's start our journey. The earliest thinkers, I'm talking even back in ancient Greece, were kind of embarrassed by their myths. You know, gods behaving badly, stories that made no logical sense. They figured there had to be some rational explanation hidden in there. They treated myths like a puzzle, a code that just needed to be cracked.
And one of the very first theories to pop up was something called euhemerism. The idea is actually pretty simple. Myths are just history that got blown way out of proportion. So you start with a real-life king who did some incredible stuff, fast forward a few hundred years of people telling that story around the campfire, and poof, that king has become a god. It was a neat way to try and ground all these fantastic stories in some kind of historical fact.
But, that answer didn't satisfy everybody. And in the 19th century, this brand new, really powerful idea started to take hold. What if the problem wasn't bad history? What if myths were born from a simple, ancient misunderstanding of words?
And this slide shows that idea perfectly. It comes from a famous scholar named Max Muller, who called it the disease of language theory. He said it all started with simple poetry. An ancient person looks at the sky and says, "The sun chases the dawn." It's a beautiful metaphor. But generations later, nobody remembers it was a metaphor. The words take on a life of their own, and suddenly you have a literal story about the god Apollo hunting the poor goddess Eos. For Mueller, pretty much all myths were just misunderstood poetry about the sun.
And then the 20th century happened, and everything got turned on its head. A whole new wave of thinkers, anthropologists, psychologists, they just stopped treating myth like some kind of primitive mistake. They started asking this revolutionary question. What if myth isn't a failed attempt at science or history? What if it's a wildly successful and essential tool for something else entirely?
The anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski came along and argued that myth is, above all, a practical tool. He called it a social charter. For him, a myth isn't really about explaining the distant past, it's about justifying how things are done right now. It's the ultimate answer to why a society has the laws, rituals, and morals that it does. It's the story that holds the entire community together.
Then you get Claude Lévi-Strauss, who had this totally mind-bending idea. He basically said, forget the specific details of the story. What really matters is its underlying structure. He believed our brains are just hardwired to think in opposites, life versus death, nature versus culture. And a myth, he argued, is like this incredible logical machine that tells a story to help us work through and resolve those deep, fundamental contradictions that we all face.
At the very same time, psychology was looking inward. Carl Jung suggested that myths aren't social charters or mental computers, but are actually maps of the human soul. He had this idea of the collective unconscious. This deep, shared psychic inheritance that all humans have, filled with universal patterns he called archetypes. The hero, the wise old man, the trickster. For Jung, myths are simply the stories these archetypes have been telling us forever.
And this brings us to the guy that most people think of when they hear the word mythology,
Joseph Campbell. He was more than just a scholar. He was a brilliant storyteller himself. And what he did was he took the work of Jung and Malinowski and all these other thinkers, and he synthesized it to ask the biggest question of all. What's the point? What do myths actually do for us as human beings?
And this was his answer. Campbell said any living, healthy mythology has to do 4 things. First, the mystical function. It has to fill you with a sense of awe and wonder. Second, the cosmological. It gives you a picture of the universe, a map of reality. Third, the sociological, which is that idea from Malinowski. It has to support your society's rules. And finally, and this is so important, the pedagogical. It has to give you a roadmap for your own life, guiding you through all the different stages from birth to old age.
So where does that leave us today? Well, now, scholars look at myth with a much more critical eye. They've built on all those 20th century ideas, but they're now really focused on questions of power, of ideology, and of whose stories get told, and maybe more importantly, whose stories get left out.
This quote from the historian Bruce Lincoln just nails the modern view. Myth is ideology in narrative form. What he's saying is that myths are never neutral. They're never just innocent stories. They are incredibly powerful tools used to make one particular worldview seem natural, inevitable, and eternal. They are arguments about power, just disguised as fairy tales.
And that leads to a really powerful and, frankly, exciting question. If myths can be used to prop up a certain power structure, say a patriarchy, then what happens when people start deliberately rewriting those very same myths to challenge it?
This is exactly what's happening right now. You can see it in this whole literary movement of feminist myth revision. You have authors like Margaret Atwood or Madeline Miller who are taking these ancient male-dominated stories and flipping the script. They're retelling them from the perspective of the female characters who are always in the background. They take someone like Circe, the evil witch, and make her the complex, relatable hero of her own story. It's a powerful form of cultural pushback, using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house.
And the field just keeps evolving. Right now, there are these 2 really cool frontiers opening up. On one hand, you have cognitive scientists who are exploring how our brains are literally built to think in mythic ways. And on the other, you have eco-mythologists who are going back to these ancient stories to look for hidden ecological wisdom, clues about how to live in balance with our planet, which feels more urgent than ever.
So look at the journey we've been on. We went from myth as a lie, to bad history, to a disease of language, to a social charter, to a map of the mind, and finally, to a tool of power. And that brings us to the most important question. The study of myth isn't just about ancient Greece or some tribe in a faraway jungle. If a myth is a powerful story that shapes our reality, what are the myths that are shaping our world right now? What are the unquestioned stories about progress or money or individualism that are running your life without you even knowing it? That's the real mystery.